Hi, I'm Professor Jason Kovacic from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and also from the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute. And I'll be speaking about genetic testing for SCAD, who should be tested and what do the results mean. So the outline of this talk is that I'll be speaking to you about genetic testing for SCAD, and I'll go through the following things. I'll first start by explaining some of the basics. Then we'll go through two different important types of gene changes that are linked to SCAD. And these are common gene changes and rare variants. Then we'll get into which patients should undergo genetic testing for SCAD. And finally, what do these results mean? So let's get going. Let's talk about common gene changes in SCAD. So, and one of the important messages that I wanted to get across today, we've come to understand from all the genetic work and lots of research that both FMD and SCAD involve changes in what are called collagen and matrix genes. So what are these things? Well, collagen is a protein that provides structural support to the tissues of our body, and that includes things like our skin. So when you pull on your skin or stretch your skin, the skin will actually come back to its natural position, and that's due to collagen, which can actually pull the skin back into that place. And you can see there on the diagram, collagen is a protein giving that structural support, and matrix are proteins and molecules that surround and support the cells and tissues. So the genetics of SCAD is quite complex, and we're going to go through this quite slowly. And we're going to talk about these two different types of gene changes: common gene changes, which are what affect the majority of people with SCAD, and rare variants, which affect around 10 to 15% of people with SCAD. And you can think of these common gene changes as many gene changes that occur to give rise to conditions like coronary artery disease. And by coronary artery disease, in this context, I mean atherosclerosis, or the buildup of fatty plaques in the arteries that cause the most common form of heart attack. Most diabetes, most high blood pressure. They also govern height and weight, most arthritis, and also stroke. Then there are rare variants, and you can think of these as single gene mutants that cause an entire disease. And rare variants can include diseases such as hemophilia, color blindness, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, cystic fibrosis, Marfan's disease, and also vascular Ehlers-Danlos. So the genetics of SCAD in an individual person can involve either or both of these types of genetic patterns. I wanted to show you this important study that we published about 10 years with a lot of collaborators. And this was the first robust genetic paper on either FMD and SCAD. And in this paper, we found that this gene, PRACTA1, was linked to FMD. And you can see here in some of the really nice pictures that we found that this gene is linked to FMD. We found that PRACTA1 is expressed. You can see it there as that dark brown color in the vessel wall, and these are the carotid, renal, femoral arteries. You can see this nice brown expression of PRACTA1 in the vessel wall. A couple of years later, we showed that the same gene and the same gene change are also linked to SCAD, and this was published back in 2019. So what's really interesting is that this PRACTA1 gene, which is the first gene ever linked to SCAD, has a very interesting pattern. It turns out that the genetic change associated with FMD and SCAD is also linked to cervical artery dissection, migraine headaches, and hypertension. And I'm sure a number of the people listening to this talk that have SCAD also do have migraine and possibly hypertension as well. What's really interesting is that the opposite form of this gene, the GG form, or the genetic change of a GG, is actually protective against SCAD, but it is linked to regular coronary artery disease, or the buildup of fatty plaques in the arteries. So in some ways, there's a bit of a trade-off between having SCAD and having this regular form of blockages in the coronary arteries. Following on from that, about a year and a half ago, we published this paper, which is an international study that involved multiple sites from Europe, America, and Australia, where we pooled our data to come up with almost 2,000 SCAD cases and 10,000 healthy controls. And together we identified 16 common gene changes, including PRACTA1, that were linked to SCAD. Each of these gene changes increased the risk of SCAD only by about 1.5 to 1.8 times, which is relatively only a small increase in risk. And the genes were mainly involved in the cells in the artery wall and more related to collagen and matrix. And these are genes like collagen 4A1 and 4A2. So these are the 16 genes we found in this study, all linked to SCAD. And you can see here's that PRACTA1 gene I was talking about. Here's these two collagen genes, 4A1 and 4A2 as well. And I can tell you that many of these other genes are also linked to collagen and matrix proteins. And what was really important for us to understand with this study, and I also wanted to convey to you, is that all of these 16 genes had common gene changes that occur across the whole population. And these gene changes are not mutations. For example, with PRACTA1, the AA form of the gene that is the most common and is associated in about 50% of the population, and that's a genetic change associated with SCAD. About 40% of the population have an AG form of this gene, while about 10% have the GG form, which is protective against SCAD, but is the risk form for regular buildup of coronary artery disease plaques. A really important finding that came out of this study was we found that these genes that are linked to SCAD are also linked to a couple of other things. So what we found is that the genes linked to SCAD are also linked to fibromuscular dysplasia and migraine headache. And so that means that these genetics are also linked to these things. And I'm sure a number of people listening to this talk have got either migraine or FMD or even both. But the good news about all of this is that the same genes that are linked to SCAD, or the direction of the gene changes, are protective for the buildup of fatty plaques which cause regular coronary artery disease. So that's obviously good news for people with SCAD, that they're genetically less likely to get regular forms of coronary artery disease with the buildup of fatty plaques. Let's move on to talk about rare variants. So rare variants, as we said, are these single gene mutants that cause an entire disease. And these are much less common than the common gene changes. And these are associated with diseases like hemophilia, color blindness, Marfan's disease, and vascular endless Darnless, as we've already said. So at the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute, we've done a lot of work on looking at rare variants. And this is a study we published a couple of years ago where we investigated 91 unrelated SCAD cases looking for rare variants in genes associated with either SCAD or genes that involve changes in collagen matrix. And what we saw, these are the genes we found. Of the 91 people we looked at, we found that 10 of those people, or about 11% of SCAD cases, had these rare variants. And you can see there again, the genes that were coming out were these collagen genes. That's collagen 3A1, collagen 4A1. Again, genes linked to collagen and matrix. So to summarize the findings of that study, from 91 SCAD cases, we identified 10 patients, or 11%, with at least one rare likely disease-causing variant in genes that are often linked to collagen and matrix. And our paper and another study suggest, therefore, that the genetics of SCAD usually involve common gene changes, like PRACTA1, but a minority, or about 10 to 15% of SCAD cases, the genes are linked to these rare gene variants. So to summarize that part of the talk, the genetics of SCAD is quite complex, but we can break it down into these two broad types of genetic changes: common gene changes, which affect the majority of people with SCAD, and rare variants, which probably account for SCAD in about 10 to 15% of people. That brings me to the next part of the talk, and which patients with SCAD should have genetic testing. So I've already said that common gene changes account for most people with SCAD. Now, the thing about regular genetic testing when people go to see a genetic counsellor or a genetic testing service is that only rare variants are identified on those forms of genetic testing. So for most people with SCAD, that's about 85 to 90% of people, regular genetic testing will be entirely uninformative. And that's why, for most people with SCAD, we don't recommend genetic testing because it's most likely to be unhelpful. In general, why do we ever send people for genetic testing with SCAD or any other possible disorder? Genetic testing is done as a confirmation of a rare gene variant that can help guide additional screening to identify other potential issues in other organ systems or vessels, or to facilitate the screening of at-risk family members. So therefore, which patients with SCAD should have genetic testing? In general, we recommend genetic testing in people with SCAD where there are certain high-risk features present. And that could be recurrent SCAD, with usually more than 3 or possibly even 2 recurrent SCADs, the presence of other features that might suggest a connective tissue disorder, a family history of arterial diseases or connective tissue disorder like arterial aneurysm, arterial dissection, family history of Marfan's disease or other, with pregnancy associated with SCAD. And I also tend to test people, even if they're not high risk, but if they want to contemplate a pregnancy after a SCAD event to ensure that there are no underlying rare variants in these people that might become pregnant. And then if people do have genetic testing for SCAD, what do these results mean? Well, the results can sometimes raise more questions than they answer. The results can be returned as either pathogenic, which means that it's almost certainly disease-causing, likely pathogenic, which is it means there's likely to have a causal link to a disease, or uncertain significance, which means we're not sure if a variant might have caused the disease. And this type of result is also called a variant of uncertain significance, or VUS. So what does that mean? It means that genetic testing for SCAD can give complicated results, and these results should always be interpreted and explained by a qualified genetics counsellor or genetics expert. So to summarise my talk then for you and give you a top 10 of who should have genetic testing for SCAD and what do the results mean. Number 1 is that the genes linked to SCAD mostly affect collagen and matrix. And collagen and matrix, these are proteins and molecules that provide structural support to tissues. For most patients with SCAD, there are many common gene changes involved. Each of these common gene changes only has a weak to modest effect on increasing the risk of SCAD. We've now identified a total of 16 of these common SCAD genes, but there are likely to be many more with even weaker effects on causing SCAD. Number 5, if you've had SCAD, you're genetically less likely to have a regular heart attack from coronary artery disease. Number 6, a minority of people with SCAD, probably around 10 to 15%, may have rare gene variants that are causing their SCAD. Genetic testing in people with SCAD is usually only recommended in persons with certain high-risk features like recurrent SCAD, pregnancy-associated SCAD, connective tissue disease features, or a strong family history. Number 8, the results of genetic testing can be complicated and should always be interpreted and explained by a qualified genetics counsellor or expert. Point number 9, we're working really hard to identify more SCAD genes and to understand the genes that we've already identified a lot better. And last, really important to say that only 5 years ago, there were no studies about the genetics of SCAD. So we've come an incredible long way in a very short period of time and now really do understand so much more about the genetics of SCAD, and the progress is going forward really at a great pace. So I'd like to just thank and acknowledge all the bodies and the institutes and the people that enable me to give this talk and to be present at Charlotte. My institutions, the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute and Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, the institutes and the things there, the bodies that sponsor the research I do, and also to the SCAD Alliance and Atrium Health. Thanks very much, and I hope this talk has been helpful.